We've been going through the subject of predestination. I'm taking this from a little bit different approach than I might do if I was trying to go through point by point and discuss the issues with Calvinism. I'm starting with an examination of the different types of words that are used for predestination, foreordination, being called or elected, and so on, especially in the New Testament, though I will address some in the Hebrew Old Testament, with the goal of trying to categorize what type of predestination they're actually talking about. It's going to take a few sessions for us to do this, and some of it will be a little bit technical, but I think it's very valuable because doing so will allow us to rule out a number of scriptures in the Bible that Calvinists might use to argue for individual predestination, of course, which I've been defining probably in every one of these sessions. The idea that individual people are predestined before they're even born to either be delivered or to be damned and destroyed, and that they have no choice in that matter. Calvinists might say you chose for yourself which of those choices you were going to make, but that truly does not follow when you understand that they believe that God foreordained you to that end result, which means whatever choices you think a person can make that they are guilty of making really don't have any bearing if God determined they were going to make those choices and go that direction regardless. So what I want to do is look at some of the passages in the Bible where the language, again, especially in the New Testament, refer to predestination or foreordination, which just means to ordain something beforehand, or that talk about God or Christ electing or choosing somebody, and determining whether or not those passages actually teach anything about individuals being elected or chosen for salvation. As we go through each of these passages, where the terminology is used for predestination, foreordination, election or selection, choosing people, and so on, we want to determine what God is foreordaining, what God is electing to occur. Is it his overall predestined plan, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with individuals being predestined? Is it his predestined processes and conditions? In other words, things that are going to happen that, again, are not the same thing as individuals being predestined. Are they his predestined actions and events, which is really almost the same thing as the last, but that he's going to do something or some event is going to occur, which again, just because God predetermines an event's going to occur or some condition is going to be present doesn't mean that these predetermined individuals are going to be saved or destroyed as a result of that. It'll be their decisions that determine that. Or, as another option, is the type of foreordination or predestination that's being referred to, the predestination of individual people, but being predestined to serve a purpose. You could be called to be a king, but that doesn't mean you're going to be called to be saved in that role. That just means you're going to carry out that role. You could be called, and I think I mentioned this in some past sessions, you could be called like Cyrus to deliver God's people. That doesn't mean you're going to be saved simply because you have that calling to serve God's purpose. There are a lot of people that serve God's purposes, some of which were very evil individuals that serve God's purpose. So being called individually to a purpose does not guarantee salvation. Then we have the corporate groups that are called. One is corporate groups of people that are predestined to serve a purpose, just like the individual people I just referred to. Israel was predestined to serve a purpose. That doesn't mean every single Israelite that's ever lived is predestined to salvation or damnation. It just means that Israel as a nation has a predestined purpose. And finally, you have corporate groups of people who are predestined to receive the promises of God. That's where we start to get into the area where some may think it's referring to individuals being predestined to life or to death, but that's not really the case. Predestining a corporate group does not directly equate to predestining specific individuals. God can predetermine that he's going to use the nation of Israel, but that doesn't mean every single Israelite who's ever lived, who was part of that nation, will be part of that predetermined purpose. God can predetermine that Abraham's descendants are going to receive his promises, but that doesn't mean every single one of Abraham's descendants will. And the same thing could be true of the church. God can predestine there's going to be a church. He predestined that the Gentiles are going to be a part of the church as a group. But that doesn't mean every single Gentile has been predestined to either be a part or not to be a part. But God pre-selected them ahead of time. It just means he has predetermined there will be Gentiles in the church. And that last is one of the most powerful counters to the Calvinistic interpretations of scriptures about salvation. And as we've seen in some of the ones we've already talked about, and as we're going to find out as we go on, you're going to see that when the Bible speaks about people being predestinated in a context that seems to be referring to them being predestinated to some level of salvation or to receive the promises of God, it does so referring to them as a corporate group, which is very different than referring to an individual person and saying, no matter what you do, you're going to be saved, or no matter what you do, you're going to face damnation and destruction. Of course, we've also got to consider, do any of the scriptures we're going to look at actually teach Calvinism's conception of individual predestination, which is that individual people are supposedly predestined before they're even born to inescapable salvation or damnation. We're going to start this portion of the study by looking at the Greek terms eklegomai and eklektos. Eklegomai is the Greek verb that means to choose or to select, and eklektos is the Greek adjective that means chosen or selected, or for that matter, elected. And we want to consider which type of selection, which type of choosing is being referred to, and whether or not any of these passages describe individual people being selected, elected, or chosen by God before their existence to be saved eternally or destroyed eternally, or whether these passages fit into one of the other categories that I am claiming are the only biblically communicated types of predestination. So let's start with Matthew 20, verse 16. It says, "So the last shall be first, and the first last, for many be called, but few chosen." The word chosen there is eklektos. This is the final statement in a parable describing a householder hiring workers in his vineyard. These workers are hired at different times of the day, and as a result, some came in earlier and worked longer, but all of them received the same wage, a penny. All of the laborers in the parable were called, and they chose to work, but not all of them had the same attitude about their payment. Some of those who worked longer weren't satisfied with their wage. The Greek word eklektos in this passage is in the plural, meaning that this is referring to a group, which is something I keep stressing because of the fact that Calvinists so heavily emphasize the idea that individual people are pre-selected to be called and chosen and to receive eternal life, or to ignore the call, to be rejected, and to receive eternal destruction. We have found thus far all of the statements about someone being chosen or predestinated are actually talking about a group of people, not about individuals. But as we're going to see in some of these passages, even if some of these statements are talking about individuals, they still are not going to fit Calvinistic conceptions of the nature of salvation. There are two different groups in this statement. There's a larger group of those who God calls. God is who this householder is picturing. That larger group is made up of many people who are called, who hear the call of God. And then there's a smaller group of those who are referred to as chosen. We're going to address this in more detail in the next passage that we're going to talk about in a few moments. But if those who are truly called and given a place to work in God's kingdom, as these workers are also chosen, as Calvinism teaches, then there shouldn't be any difference between those he calls and those he chooses, since according to Calvinism, no one can respond to his call unless he's chosen them. I hope I didn't overcomplicate that in the way I just worded it, but let me try to say that simpler. Calvinism believes that the only people who can hear and respond to God's call are those he has already chosen, predestined to hear and respond to that call, and those are the ones who will go on and receive eternal life. On the other side of that coin, they believe that those who are not predestined to life, but are predestined to destruction, will never truly hear in the sense of registering the message of that call in their minds and respond to the call, and thus will never be able to receive life. But this passage differentiates between those who are called and who clearly respond to that call positively by going into the field and working for God, and those who are chosen, who have a much better attitude than some of the ones who are in a different category, not because they were pre-selected, but because they qualified themselves by their spirit and attitude and actions in a way that's different from some of the others, as you can see in the story. Those who are chosen are not chosen by God before he called them. They're chosen because of how they worked and the spirit they did it in after he called and hired them, and the attitude they had about the reward, and for that matter, their fellow laborers. Calvinism holds that God gives salvation, including the ability to respond to the call to come to him, only to the elect. But notice in this passage, especially if you read all of it, I only quoted the last verse, the householder repeatedly goes out to invite more workers. He keeps expanding the group, not narrowing it down. He's the one who initiates the invitation, not the workers. And that's very critical because according to Calvinism, if God calls people and they hear that call and respond to that call, they have to be chosen, which is not what this passage is saying. So they might argue that it's just other workers in the kingdom calling people, and God never really called them, like evangelists who are trying to evangelize people who maybe God has never chosen. But this doesn't describe ministers calling to the people. It's God calling to them. All of this is the opposite of Calvinism's idea that God's already decided who will receive saving grace and who will not. Calvinism says that God gives an effectual call only to the elect. But here we see that the master goes out early in the morning, again at the 3rd hour, then at the 6th hour, then at the 9th hour, and again at the 11th hour. This isn't a selective predestination. This is a persistent, repetitive, universal invitation. Calvinism says the elect were chosen before the foundation of the world, but Jesus says the last will be first and the first last. That entirely reverses human expectations and destroys the idea of a fixed, predetermined hierarchy or group of pre-selected individuals. If they were pre-selected from the very beginning, then they would have to be the first, whereas Christ is saying the last will be first and the first last, because there have been people invited all down through history. And some of the ones who were invited earlier than others got an elder brother's spirit when people later were invited. So the calling didn't start in some primordial period in the past before human beings even existed. The call occurs at the moment that the gospel message goes out and someone hears it. And then it's up to them to choose to respond to it one way or the other. The next passage uses one of these words in Matthew 22:14. Which again uses this statement, many are called, but few are chosen, chosen being the Greek word eklektos. This whole passage, beginning with the first verse of Matthew 22 down through the 14th verse, provides a strong challenge to the Calvinistic doctrine of irresistible grace, which is the I in the acronym TULIP, T-U-L-I-P. Jesus uses Calvinism's own technical vocabulary and explicitly separates the terms called and chosen in this statement. In the parable, the king sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they wouldn't come. See that in the 3rd verse. The call's repeated, the invitees refuse, even mock the invitation, and some even kill the servants who were sent to call them. And then finally, others to replace them are gathered from the highways. The parable concludes with this statement that many are called, but few are chosen. In the 14th verse. There's 2 pretty clear conclusions from this passage. Number 1, the calling is resistible, not irresistible. The king issues a direct personal call repeatedly, and the invited guests refuse it. This is entirely incompatible with Calvinism's claim that the saving call cannot be resisted by the elect. The second thing is, Jesus distinguishes the called from the chosen, as we saw in the last verse we talked about. The called constitute the larger group. The chosen are a smaller subset. Calvinism's effectual call doctrine identifies these groups as one and the same, but Jesus separates them. And Luke 14:8 reinforces that pattern when it says that those invited, all with one consent, begin to make excuse. Put simply, the passage shows that God calls many who are not ultimately saved, contradicting the Calvinist claim that God only gives the saving call to the elect and that this call is irresistible. Calvinism also teaches that the elect receive an effectual call while the non-elect receive what they might call only an external call. But Matthew 22 separates calling from election in a way that shows that the call is not identical with election, doesn't guarantee salvation, and isn't limited to the elect. That undermines the idea that God only gives a saving call to those who are supposedly unconditionally chosen before creation. Both called and chosen are in the plural, indicating that they're referring to groups rather than predetermined individuals. The many who are called can't be restricted to the elect, who according to Calvinism would respond irresistibly. Instead, the parable depicts a broad group who hear the call and a smaller group who respond positively and are therefore chosen. Thus, those who are chosen aren't the same as those who are called. The passage doesn't portray individuals predestined to salvation or damnation. Instead, it describes people being genuinely called who have to then choose whether or not they're going to respond. Those who respond positively are chosen, not because of a predeterministic decree that was made before their creation, but because after being called, they freely responded, and that response is what leads to them being chosen. Our next passage is 2 chapters later in Matthew 24, 22 to 24, and I'm going to read the 31st verse as well. That's paralleled, by the way, in Mark 13, 20 to 22 and 13, 27. It says, "Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." And down the 31st verse it says, "And he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." All of those examples, the word elect is the Greek word eklektos. All three examples of that word, by the way, are in the plural, which means they're referring to a group. Thus, this is a corporate group who's been chosen, and not necessarily specific individuals. A group can be predetermined to exist without all the individuals in it being predetermined to be a part of that group. In addition, the fact that this group of individuals being referred to as chosen, as elect, doesn't mean they were chosen before they were born, or that they were chosen by God to be saved despite their own choices. It simply refers to this group as being chosen. And even if it could be argued that each member was chosen, it doesn't tell us when or by what qualification they were chosen. God predestined that there would be a group who are his corporate chosen people. Whether or not you're a part of that chosen group, though, will depend upon your choices. In Luke 6:13, it says, "When it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, who also he named apostles." The word "chose" there is the Greek word eklegomai. This isn't referring to Jesus, or God for that matter, having chosen the disciples to be saved. It's referring to them being chosen to fill the place and to serve the purpose of being Jesus' apostles. Moving on to Luke 18:7, it says, "Shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him?" The word elect is eklektos. It's in the plural. It's pointing to this referring to a corporate group, not to an individual. But again, even if each person in this chosen group is individually elected, chosen, that doesn't tell us that God chose them before they were born. It just tells us that he chose them. I believe he chose them to be a part of the group because when he called them, they chose to respond to that call. The bottom line is that there's a vast difference between being chosen by God before you're even born, or to either be saved or destroyed without any possibility of changing that result, and someone being chosen by God because of their choices and responses to his call. Remember that back in Matthew 22:14, there's a difference between those who were called and those who were chosen. The primary difference is that those who were chosen are the ones who responded positively to the call. Another passage is Luke 23:35. It says, "The people stood beholding, and the rulers also with them derided him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he be Christ, the chosen of God." Chosen there is eklektos. This isn't a reference, though, to Jesus being chosen to be saved. It refers to him being chosen to be the Messiah. Moving on, John 15:16 and 15:19, he says, "You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit." And then the 19th verse, "I have chosen you out of the world." All those chosens are the Greek word eklegomai. And just as with all the examples we've seen of the language about predestination or foreordination, or being chosen in this way, all of the pronouns in this passage referring to the disciples are in the plural, meaning that Jesus is referring to a group that has been chosen. Some Calvinists claim this is referring to Jesus individually choosing the disciples to be saved prior to their decision to follow him. But this is not referring to being chosen for salvation. It's referring to him choosing them to be apostles, choosing them to fill a predestined position, role, and purpose. The context here is apostolic appointment, not predestination to salvation. John 15:16, by the way, is part of Jesus' farewell statements to his 11 disciples. Judas had already left at this point, so he's speaking to men who've already followed him. He isn't describing God choosing individuals for salvation before creation, or the Calvinistic ideas of irresistible grace or unconditional election. He's describing his selection of the apostles, their commission, and their mission, for that matter, to bear fruit. This is what we call functional choosing, choosing someone to serve a functional purpose, not salvific choosing someone to be saved or not to be saved. It's a calling to fill a purpose, not a calling to be eternally saved. In my humble but firm belief, the very heart of the heresy of Calvinism is the concept that God predetermined, or you might say foreordained, that every single minute event in all of the creation would happen exactly as it has happened or will happen, meaning all the great and good things, as well as all of the most horrific evils, were all his specific intents and desire, and that as part of this exhaustive dictatorial determinism, every man and woman has already, before their existence, been pre-selected either to be eternally saved or eternally damned, not by their own true choice that could have been changed if they had chosen to do differently, but by God's predetermined desire to deliver or destroy them even before he created them. The question we have to ask as we go through these and other passages that we're going to go through in future studies is that what the Bible actually teaches? Undeniably, the Bible teaches that God foreordains and predetermines many things, but the presence of his predetermination in certain events of history or in callings to accomplish his purpose doesn't necessarily equate to him pre-selecting who he would punish before they were even created, and thus creating people simply to punish them. That is what Calvinism teaches, that God effectively decided that he was going to create a massive number of human beings simply to curse them and punish them eternally. Of course, they try to spin this by saying that all human beings were worthy of that punishment, and that God did something good by selecting some of those human beings to be saved from that punishment. But that is nothing more than soteriological spin, since Calvinism's conception of God is that he began with a blank slate, and that he consciously decided to create evil human beings simply to punish them, and in the majority view of most Calvinists throughout history, to torment them forever. Those who believe in the idea of eternal conscious torment and who also believe in Calvinism would have to conclude that God created many human beings solely for the purpose of eternally torturing them, since he could have chosen to do anything he wanted with them, including creating them all to be his elect. That last point is perhaps the most shocking of all. If, as Calvinism teaches, the salvation of the elect is due to God predetermining that they would be saved, then he could have predetermined that all of his creation would be saved. Instead, in the tortured view of Calvinism, God supposedly thought it would be more glorious to not save the majority of his creation, but instead to condemn them to eternal destruction. And he determined that he would do that before he even created them, thus creating them in order to destroy them. Forgive me, but such an idea is a blasphemous defamation of the character and of the justice of the Almighty God, who I believe is righteous and holy in all of his ways. Just one of many biblical statements to that fact is in Deuteronomy 32:4, where it says, "He is the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are judgment, a God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he." Does the preceding picture of Calvinism's conception of God sound anything like perfect, just, and right? Is it just to pre-plan that you'll create individuals who you will assure are incapable of responding to your offer of salvation and your expressions of love, then curse them for not doing so, expressing wrath at their actions that you designed and determined that they would do, and then finally casting them into eternal destruction for daring to resist your will when you were the one who made certain that they did so? Such a God is not the God of the Bible. It would certainly not be a God of true justice and righteousness, but that is the God of Calvinism. And it's why I'm spending the amount of time I'm going to spend going through the subject of predestination and the Calvinistic conception of it. We have to rightly define and not defame the character of the God of truth.